In a cramped, dimly lit basement beneath Pearl Harbor's 14th Naval District headquarters, a handful of exhausted men hunched over typewriters and intercepts, their faces pale in the glow of flickering lamps. Outside, the Pacific roared with the power of Japan's seemingly unstoppable navy. But here, silence and cigarette smoke filled the air. Each keystroke and whispered theory carried the weight of thousands of lives. This was no battlefield of steel and fire. It was a chessboard, and every move mattered. These cryptographers weren't armed with rifles or bombs-only intuition, mathematics, and desperation. Yet their race against time would tilt history itself. Within days, the Japanese fleet would sail toward what they believed was an ambush-proof victory. They had no idea that their every move was being watched. Victory in the Pacific would not be forged by brute force alone, but by shadows, whispers, and minds sharp enough to outwit an empire. By the spring of 1942, the Pacific was a Japanese lake. Their navy ruled with 6 fleet carriers, dozens of battleships, and a battle-hardened air arm that had humiliated every opponent it faced. Just 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had been reduced to smoking ruins, leaving the United States scrambling to rebuild. Island after island had fallen wake, Guam. The Philippines and Japan's momentum seemed unstoppable. Morale in America was shaken, and the U.S. Navy's carrier force was all that stood between Japan and total dominance. Admiral Isaraku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed the time had come to deliver a knockout blow. His plan was bold: lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll, a tiny dot in the Pacific, barely visible on maps. Its location, however, made it a perfect forward base and a tempting target. Japan's plan was simple: crush the U.S. fleet, secure Midway, and extend their defensive perimeter beyond American reach. But behind the Japanese confidence, a quiet storm was brewing, one that would shift the Pacific War's momentum. Before a single shot was fired, deep inside Pearl Harbor Station Hypo, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team faced an impossible puzzle: Japan's naval code, JN-25. It wasn't a simple cipher, but a labyrinth of numbers, layered with additives and ever-changing keys. Every day, thousands of intercepted Japanese transmissions poured in, most of them meaningless without the right context. Yet Rochefort's small group of linguists, mathematicians, and radio operators chipped away at the code, piece by piece, often working 16-hour days in sweltering windowless rooms. They had no supercomputers, no advanced technology, only intuition, pattern recognition, and the occasional stroke of luck. Gradually, phrases emerged. Fleet movements, vague references to a mysterious target labeled only AF. The Americans knew this was crucial, but confirming what AF meant would be the difference between springing a trap or walking into one. Many in Washington dismissed their findings as speculation, but Rochefort's instincts told him they were onto something monumental. In a war fought with aircraft carriers and battleships, these cryptographers were proving that intelligence could be the deadliest weapon of all. The question was whether anyone would believe them in time. Convincing the top brass was no easy task. Many senior officers believed Rochefort's warnings were guesswork, a risky gamble in an already desperate situation. The Pacific Fleet couldn't afford to commit carriers based on hunches, and Washington's analysts were skeptical of Station HYPO's conclusions. But Rochefort's team was certain AF meant Midway. To prove it, they devised a clever ruse. Midway's garrison sent an unencrypted radio message claiming their water purification plant had failed. Days later, Japanese transmissions reported that AF was running low on fresh water, and the trap was set, and the codebreaker's theory was confirmed. Yet, even with proof, tension ran high. Betting America's last carriers on intelligence rather than overwhelming force was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz, however, placed his trust in Rochefort and ordered preparations for battle. While Japanese commanders believed they were drawing the U.S. into a perfect ambush, in reality, the hunters had become the hunted. The outcome of the Pacific War would now hinge on this daring faith in intelligence over firepower. Far from the strategy rooms, Midway Atoll was a lonely speck of coral and sand, bracing for war. Its garrison of Marines and Navy personnel lived under constant tension. Fortifying bunkers, laying barbed wire, and manning anti-aircraft guns, Pilots stationed there flew daily patrols over an endless ocean, scanning for shadows on the horizon. They knew they were bait, sent to draw out an enemy force far stronger than their own. Among them were men like Lieutenant James P. Gray, a young aviator whose diary revealed both dread and determination. The island's airstrip was little more than a strip of crushed coral, and living quarters were Spartan huts battered by Pacific winds. Supplies were scarce, and every man understood that Midway's defenses would crumble under a sustained assault. Yet morale was surprisingly high. They trusted Admiral Nimitz and the fleet gathering somewhere beyond the horizon. Every hammer strike, every sandbag placed, carried silent defiance. These men were preparing to stand against an empire unaware their courage would soon be immortalized. The ocean around Midway was deceptively calm, masking the approaching storm that would test them all. With Japan's plan exposed, Admiral Chester Nimitz turned intelligence into action. Instead of scattering his limited forces, he concentrated America's last three carriers, the battle-tested Enterprise and Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown north of Midway, where Japanese scouts wouldn't expect them. Every move was calculated, every risk immense. Nimitz was gambling that Rochefort's information was precise down to the hour, trusting that his smaller, battered fleet could ambush the most powerful navy on Earth. While Japanese commanders believed they were dictating the terms of battle, American carriers lurked like wolves in the shadows. Crews worked feverishly, patching planes, stacking bombs, and studying enemy flight patterns. The plan required flawless timing. Strike first, strike hard, and cripple the Japanese carriers before they could react. The entire operation hinged on secrecy and the element of surprise. From the skies above Midway to the decks of Nimitz's carriers, tension was palpable. Pilots sharpened their focus. Mechanics worked without rest. Americans were outgunned, but not out-hot. The stage was set, and both sides now sailed toward a collision that would decide the Pacific's future. June 4, 1942 dawned with a fiery roar. Japanese bombers struck Midway first, their precision attacks turning fuel tanks and aircraft hangars into towering infernos. The defenders fought back fiercely, scrambling outdated fighters to challenge waves of Zeros. Meanwhile, far to the northeast, American carriers prepared their strike. Torpedo squadrons launched first, flying low and slow, knowing they had little chance of returning. One by one, they were cut down, their attacks failing to land a single hit. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. The chaos forced Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly, decks cluttered with armed planes and exposed fuel lines. At that critical moment, American dive bombers arrived. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were ablaze, explosions ripping through their decks. A fourth Hiryu would fall hours later. The ocean, moments before calm, was now littered with burning wreckage. The Japanese fleet was stunned, its proud air arms shattered. Against staggering odds, the Americans had delivered a devastating blow. Yet victory wasn't just luck, it was the culmination of intelligence, bravery, and timing. The Battle of Midway proved that wars aren't only won with guns and ships there, won with knowledge. Every burning Japanese carrier was a testament to the weeks of painstaking code-breaking that made this ambush possible. Rochefort's quiet team in Pearl Harbor had turned intercepted numbers into actionable intelligence, giving Nimitz the confidence to take an enormous gamble. Without their work, those carriers would have been waiting with decks clear, planes ready, and American losses catastrophic. Japan's overconfidence was its undoing. Believing the U.S. Navy was broken, Japanese commanders underestimated both American resolve and ingenuity. While their strategy was bold, it lacked the element of surprise they assumed was theirs alone. Instead, their carriers sailed straight into a trap laid by a handful of cryptographers and a daring admiral. The victory was not flawless. The U.S. lost Yorktown and scores of brave pilots, but its impact was undeniable. Midway demonstrated that intellect could shift the balance of power as decisively as brute force. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japan's advance was halted, and its aura of invincibility shattered forever. Midway wasn't just a battle. It was a turning point. In a single day, Japan lost 4 irreplaceable carriers, over 250 planes, and many of its most experienced pilots, men whose training had taken years. the Japanese Navy would never again go on the offensive with the same confidence. For America, the psychological shift was profound. The fleet that had been bloodied at Pearl Harbor now stood as a formidable force, proving it could strike back with precision. Strategists hailed Midway as the momentum shifted permanently in the Pacific. It showcased the power of intelligence-driven warfare, where information was as lethal as bombs. Yet the heroes of Station Ipoh remained largely unrecognized for decades. Their victory was overshadowed by the dramatic carrier battles they made possible, their achievements sealed in classified files. Today, historians see Midway as a masterpiece of planning, courage, and calculated risk. It turned a vulnerable outpost into the graveyard of Japan's naval supremacy. And while the war would rage for 3 more brutal years, Midway planted the seed of eventual Allied victory. When people picture World War II, they imagine roaring engines, thunderous gunfire, and fiery explosions. Yet Midway was a battle first won in silence. In dim rooms filled with clacking typewriters and exhausted men deciphering fragments of enemy chatter, Rochefort's team never fired a shot, yet their work crippled an empire's ambitions. This victory was not just a triumph of courage, but of intellect, proving that the sharpest weapon of war can be a mind that sees patterns others miss. Admiral Yamamoto's bold strategy collapsed, because it was no longer a secret, and America seized an advantage it desperately needed. In a war that had begun with humiliation at Pearl Harbor, Midway restored hope and shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. But this victory came at a steep cost. Brave pilots perished in flaming skies, and the Yorktown lay at the ocean's bottom. The price of turning the tide was heavy, but its impact was undeniable. Midway reminds us that history often pivots on moments invisible to most, shaped by decisions made in shadow. Would Japan's dominance have endured had those messages gone unread? Could the Pacific have become a fortress beyond Allied reach? Share your thoughts. Was Midway America's luckiest break, or its smartest gamble?